En marzo de 2023, la Comisión de Revisión Económica y de Seguridad de Estados Unidos y China convocó a diversos expertos y expertas para una audiencia especial sobre la influencia global de China y las actividades de interferencia. Entre las expertas estuvo Caitlin Deering Scott, directora adjunta de Estrategia, Desarrollo y Operaciones en el Centro para el Impacto Global de IRI. Caitlin Scott también se desempeña como líder del equipo de la cartera, contrarrestando la influencia autoritaria extranjera del Instituto Republicano Internacional. Desde el IRI trabaja para reforzar la resiliencia democrática a la creciente influencia autoritaria y la interferencia de la República Popular China y el Kremlin, entre otros. ¿Qué preocupa al Congreso de Estados Unidos sobre China?
Over the past decade, we've seen an increase in People's Republic of China efforts to exert economic and political influence globally. At a strategic level, we believe that the PRC's actions in the developing world and in the developed world reflect a broader strategic goal of creating a world more safe for autocracies like the Chinese Communist Party. Ideally, from Beijing's perspective, a system like this would have the PRC firmly at its center. This is concerning for the United States and other allied actors, as the desire to spread Chinese wisdom, to borrow Xi Jinping's phrase, often weakens democratic institutions and strengthens the liberal actors in the process. It has the potential to undermine democracy and good governance and in the US and in allied countries throughout the world.
La preocupación es que China y su visión de promover y reforzar modelos autoritarios terminen siendo amigables a sus intereses geopolíticos.
I'll take an example from Latin America. In El Salvador, for example, the mutual embrace of the PRC and the Bukele administration has created a symbiotic relationship that has allied the international community's increasing economic, social, and political pressure on the Salvadorian government to become more democratic and less corrupt. In exchange, China is building a strategic hub in the region long allied with the United States. This relationship between the PRC and El Salvador, as an increasingly authoritarian country, mutually reinforces each government's authoritarian practices in the international space. China's strategic investment in El Salvador reflects the PRC's evolving posture in the larger Latin America region, meant to influence El Salvador's economy. PRC strategy focuses on increased engagement through access and investment in infrastructure and technology, and many of the proposed projects are not economically viable or may undermine transparency and democratic governance. Of course, there are real domestic drivers of these authoritarian tendencies, and countries like El Salvador don't forcibly rely on China for the adoption of authoritarian practices. That said, engagement with China has provided countries like El Salvador an economic and political partner that can help it withstand both domestic and international pressure for reform to address democratic backsliding. And in return, countries like El Salvador align with the PRC in international fora, whether through votes in the UN on things such as Xinjiang and other PRC human rights violations, or in upholding the One China policy vis-a-vis Taiwan.
¿De qué manera las operaciones de China debilitan las instituciones y afectan negativamente a un entorno de transparencia y rendición de cuentas?
The PRC approach to infrastructure lending has resulted in opacity that may foster corruption, undermine international lending best practices, and subvert democratic accountability for the allocation of public funds. Infrastructure projects financed by the Export-Import Bank of China are awarded to Chinese companies as part of the terms and conditions of the contract, rather than being subject to open tenders. Many of the loans do not also conform to Paris Club standards, raising concerns about sustainable debt relief.
¿De qué hablamos cuando se plantea que el enfoque chino prescinde de la democracia por un modelo con más posibilidades de éxito económico?
PRC's direct control of the economy and of state-owned enterprises and banks certainly enables it to take quicker action from an economic perspective. But the reality is that PRC economic investment and its model is not always all it promises to be, and the corruption inherent in the systems means that it isn't actually delivering for people in the way it is promised. Whether money's being siphoned off from infrastructure projects to bribe corrupt officials, or whether a proposed infrastructure project doesn't yield the jobs it promises or the local development. The examples are numerous, and there are clear myths that need to be dispelled about the realities of the PRC economic model of governance. They also come at a very clear cost to transparency, accountability, good governance, and human rights, which ultimately undermines broader socioeconomic system. I think certainly more needs to be done to demonstrate how democracy can deliver, but democracy does deliver, and the PRC economic model of governance comes at a great cost.
¿Cuáles son las diferencias más notables entre China y Occidente al momento de hacer negocios?
While Western economic engagement is certainly not immune to corruption or to benefiting political and economic elite, countries like the US have strict standards for ensuring that economic assistance and trade engagement is transparent and not facilitating corruption or elite capture. Mechanisms such as the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act or the Magnitsky sanctions are key safeguards that just don't exist in China.
¿Cómo China transfiere tecnologías y prácticas para aumentar la vigilancia y la represión a través de tecnologías digitales y de información?
From smart cities to the export of surveillance systems to providing training on citizen monitoring and China's model of cyber governance, China uses a range of tactics to export its digital repression. In Zimbabwe, for example, an increasingly important facet of the Zimbabwe-China relationship is the sharing of surveillance equipment and capabilities. Zimbabwe's government has used PRC technology to oppress its people while citing the PRC's approach to cyber governance as a model. In 2021, for example, Zimbabwean lawmakers allied with the ruling party cited the PRC developed concept of cyber sovereignty as grounds for implementing the Data Protection Act, which human rights advocates have pointed out grants the government broad authority to access the communications of private citizens. It has provisions that can be used by the government to silence online dissent and to criminalize viewing content critical of the country's political leaders. The Zimbabwean government has increasingly used hardware and expertise provided by the PRC to silence political opposition, monitor its citizens online, and restrict internet freedoms.
¿Por qué debería preocupar que Nicaragua y Honduras rompieran relaciones con Taiwán y las iniciaran con China?
IRA's research has consistently shown that increased economic engagement, one of the main promises to countries switching diplomatic recognition from Taiwan to the PRC, remains the key entry point for other forms of PRC influence. Senior officials in Beijing recognize that economic influence through trade or infrastructure lending translates into influence in many other spheres. Beijing knows that robust trade relationships are a shortcut to creating powerful, sustainable pro-PRC lobbying blocs because of the influence businesses have on politics and foreign policy. This offers pathways for China to exert influence in the information space, whether through buying stakes in media, with a resultant impact on coverage of China and China-related issues, which should be of concern to the free press. It also offers pathways for things like political party trainings and exchanges, where China is sharing its model of governance with potential resultant impacts, fundamental freedoms related to civil society, freedom of expression, etc.
¿La creciente influencia china es una señal de debilidad de la política exterior de Estados Unidos hacia América Latina?
I think there are generally concerns around U.S. engagement in the region, but that this is also a reflection of broader governance trends across Latin America and limited popular support for democracy or a real focus on engaging economically. I think looking ahead, it's really essential. It's not necessarily possible to compete with China on an economic level with regards to the provision of economic support, etc. But I think the U.S. needs to take a look at its toolkit with regard to engagement across the region and adjust it accordingly to the needs of the time, which means a real focus on economic issues, on anti-corruption and transparency, on the environment, on things that are most important to people and in which China's narrative is gaining ground. But I do think there still remains an opportunity given the strong connections between the United States and the region.